Welcome to Investing in Integrity. I'm Ross Overline, CEO and co-founder of Scholars of Finance, a rapidly growing organization on a mission to inspire character and integrity in the finance leaders of tomorrow. If you're an investor, finance professional, or student aspiring to make an impact with capital, this show is for you. Investing in Integrity brings you conversations with leading minds in finance to help you learn how you can make finance a force for good by investing in integrity. Hello, everybody. I'm Ross Overline, and you are joining us today for the Investing in Integrity podcast. I'm really excited to have you here. I'm fortunate to be joined today by JC Swaan. JC is a lecturer at Princeton University on the topic of ethics and finance, among others. He also teaches at Cambridge University and is a partner at Cornwall Capital, a New York-based investment fund. JC is also on the advisory board of Scholars of Finance and has many other roles. And one thing we'll talk about today is he is the author of Seeking Virtue in Finance, Contributing to Society in a Conflicted Industry, which was just published in September. And we'll talk about today. JC, it's so great to have you on today. Thanks for coming.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, Ross. I really am looking forward to this.
Likewise. JC, can you maybe just kick us off by sharing a brief background on your life and career, sort of the headlines?
Sure. So let me start by saying that, I've always been interested in this concept of finance as a force for good and as a kind of a vehicle to promote economic prosperity, right? And so I studied economic development and public policy in grad school, and eventually went to work for McKinsey in management consulting for a few years. But I was always interested in testing out this idea that finance could be helpful to society. And so I moved to the buy side to become an institutional investor, an investment professional. And I was particularly interested in investing in emerging markets to test out this idea of finance being helpful to economies, and particularly emerging economies. And now the reality is, so I started by working in a long-short equity fund dedicated to Asia. And it literally took me like a week or two to realize that I was having almost no impact, if perhaps none whatsoever in these economies. And it really drove me to think harder about what is it about finance that is helpful. And so I ended up delving into it in the form of a course. My true passion is teaching. I taught as a graduate student, and I created a course, and then eventually several courses. But I've been, for the past 12 years, dividing my time between teaching and investing. And as you mentioned, on the teaching side, I focus on ethics and finance. I also focus on emerging markets and specifically Asia, but a lot of these themes overlap.
That is absolutely fantastic. And I love hearing the narrative arc of this desire to make an impact in finance from the very beginning and really venturing into finance to do that. I think it's interesting that even just 2 weeks into your role, you realize you needed to rethink that decision. I would have imagined there was some fear, some consternation around that decision you had just made. What was it like to sort of navigate from that into the next finance role where you felt like you were going to be making an impact and even teaching?
Well, I think part of the desire to delve deeper into these issues and to study them was to understand where to pick my spot, in a sense. And I think over the years, I've found myself migrating to areas of finance that I think are increasingly helpful to society. So I've stayed in the investment world, and I spend my time now for the last 10 years or so with a New York-based hedge fund, Cornwall Capital, and it's just a very thoughtful fund. The founder there is very attached to these issues and always keen to understand them better. And over the years, I've migrated to venture capital and to friendly, constructive activism, and to private equity and all sorts of areas that I think I can have greater impact than, say, long short equity, where we're simply buying and selling shares in public markets and secondary market from other investors.
Right. That, I think, segues perfectly into opening up our discussion about your book. I'm really excited to talk about Seeking Virtue in Finance today with you. I've read it, really enjoyed it. I have copious pages of notes. There's so much in it. It's a very dense read, a very enjoyable read. You offer a 4-pillar framework for how you think finance professionals can contribute to society positively. And I'd love to dive into each one individually, but first, can you just share the high-level message? If you had to, in a minute or two, summarize the message of Seeking Virtue in Finance for our audience. What is that? What is the high-level message?
Sure. And in fact, to talk about the message, maybe I'll say a word about what got me to it, because I think that's important. And it's, when I started teaching 12 years ago, it was clear to me that a lot of my students were interested in finance, but concerned about being corrupted the minute they walked into their first job on Wall Street. And that led me to think about this conundrum of wanting to work in finance, but also wanting to contribute to society. And so I created this course on ethics in finance. And the first semester I taught it, midway through my first semester, one of my students asked me, why is it that we only talk about unethical behavior? Why do we not talk about constructive behavior, inspiring individuals, and try to learn from them? And I thought about it, and I thought, of course, why is it that we never devote attention to these people and try to learn from them? And so I set out to try to find that literature for the course. I could not find it, and so ended up trying to develop the research myself, and I made it part of the course. And the idea was to identify remarkable individuals who counter the narrative of self-serving behavior in finance. And my goal was really to find individuals that we could relate to. So not necessarily like altruistic individuals, because that's hard to relate to, but folks who are self-interested, they ambitious, successful, but each in their own ways. And the important thing is these are individuals who manage to balance their self-interest with the collective interest, despite the relentless pressure for them to focus on short-term profit maximization. And the goal was really to tease out patterns of virtuous behavior from these individuals. And so the message of the book is that we can carve out a virtuous path in finance despite the massive constraints and pressure. And it's a path that allows you to balance your self-interest with the collective interest.
Thank you so much for taking it back to the founding story of how the inspiration came to you. And thank God for that student who offered that constructive point on the early class. I can say the students and scholars of finance have largely shaped our organization. Their intuition, their innovative thinking has been instrumental to our growth. And I'm happy to hear that sort of the genesis of virtue in finance on both of our ends is coming from the next generation, really. They're helping shape it and helping drive the thinking. So there are 4 pillars. What are the 4 pillars?
So the first one is serving your customers' interests with your customers' interest in mind, in a sense like prioritizing your customers' interests, being faithful to their interests, even when no one is looking. And the idea is that in finance, it's often the case that no one is looking because finance, relative to other industries, happens to be complex. It's often opaque. And there's also often a fair amount of asymmetry of knowledge and information between the service provider and their customer. And that's particularly the case if their customers are retail customers. So there's no pillar that's more important than the professional mandate. So that's the first one. The second one is serving your customers' interests without extracting value from other stakeholders and from the rest of the world, and ideally by creating value for the rest of the world and other stakeholders. The third pillar is about humanistic leadership, and it's really about treating colleagues with dignity. It's about helping develop them, helping empower them, and also fostering a responsible culture, and that includes promoting diversity within your organization. And then finally, the fourth pillar is about being a good citizen, but using all the tools that you've developed as a finance professional in order to contribute to society. And so that can mean using the skill set that you've developed as a finance professional. It can be using your network. It could also be using your savings and your wealth to the extent that you've created wealth. And that can be in parallel to your professional job, your professional mandate, or it could be after, once you leave the industry and do something else.
Thanks, JC. I think that the four pillars, the framework that you've put together here for carving a virtuous path in finance, right? Balancing intrinsic self-interest with the interests of others and the greater good, if you will, I think makes a lot of sense. And I love how robust it is, right? This notion of customer mandate, serving customers' interest faithfully, right? Ensure that you're doing an excellent job at your job. And I'm excited to unpack that while you're serving your clients. Create wealth, create value for society, and make sure you don't extract value, right? Actually adding an additional layer of consideration around the actual financial activity itself. And then outside of the investing decisions day to day, having this third, which is how you treat people. What's the culture you create in the firm?
Right.
What are your day-to-day interactions like within the firm? And then I love that this fourth pillar then turns outwards towards the community. What are you doing in your day-to-day outside of your financial activity, serving your customers, being virtuous in your financial activity, treating your team well? What are you doing outside of the four walls of work? Again, with your expertise, time, and resources. So it feels like a pretty robust, full framework that someone can really use to vet every dimension of their life almost as a finance professional.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was a little bit of the idea of having a holistic perspective on being a finance professional as a citizen, as a good citizen.
Absolutely. And I love some of the references you make in the book to Aristotle, to a few thought leaders of old, right, who helped us think about what a virtuous life looks like. With that, I'd love to dive into the first pillar and sort of take these one at a time for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. Number one, customer mandate, serving customers' interests faithfully. I would love to hear you unpack that a little bit more. What does that look like in a day-to-day and beyond the obvious? And what do you think are some of the key salient and unique points in your book that you think are important for our listeners to hear today about how they can serve customers faithfully? What might get in the way?
Well, I mean, I'll say what can get in the way. First is every financial firm in the world will say that they prioritize their customers' interests, right? So that's not differentiating. But the reality is that not all of them do. And sometimes they don't because they try to extract as much value as possible from their customers. And so they, in a sense, have a little bit of a shorter term perspective, because this is one where if you were purely commercially driven, a long-term approach to your commercial interests would converge with this idea of serving or prioritizing your customers' interests, because that would be essentially the same. But then there's this issue of cognitive biases. There are all sorts of cognitive biases, and this is a fertile area of research, and that's been the case for years now. But it's this idea that finance is particularly fertile grounds for these biases because of the complexity and the opacity of the industry. And what you find is these concept of bounded awareness, for instance. And it's this idea that you can be so entangled in your bubble inside of work, where you have these incredibly challenging short-term goals on a daily basis, right? Every day you're hustling to try to get to your goals, and you have folks that are above you that keep asking you for these deliverables, and it's hard to stop and take stock of what you're actually doing, right? To the extent that you're delivering on things that the folks above you are asking you to deliver on, and to the extent that you're emulating the behavior of the people that you see around that are successful at your firm, why would you question it, right? And in reality, what we find is that you can have very smart people who are good people who end up making bad decisions in the workplace because they're not able to step out of that role and think of the moral dimension of their everyday decisions, of their everyday activities. And that, frankly, it's not easy. And it's not easy in part because there's an environment that's going to push you in one direction. And also the reality is that finance is really underpinned by finance theory. And if you go back to finance theory, the neoclassical framework is really about to the extent that you pursue your interest, your self-interest, then it will be good for your firm, it will be good for the client, it will be good for society, right? That's the underlying assumption, but we know that not to be the case. That's often not the case. And so this concept of bounded awareness is very, I think, very salient for finance. There's also these concepts of motivated blindness, right? When you see, if for instance you're a senior person at your firm, but you see junior folks skating too close to the edge, but getting getting to their objectives, delivering on what they need to do, perhaps bringing in revenues, then you might just turn your attention away and not question things that an outsider in the same position with the same perhaps educational background, the same outlook on life, might look at this and say, wow, that's unethical. You shouldn't do that, right? And that's where you see examples like, the Wells Fargo case, for instance, is a good example that where, the reality is a lot of these folks are, I'm sure well-meaning people, and but they got into these modes of thinking where they weren't able to get out and to step away from their role and to take stock of what they were doing on a daily basis. So I think, in a sense, serving your customers with your customers' interest in mind is both. There's both an aspect to it which is about making sure that it's an explicit priority, but even if it's an explicit priority, the challenge is to be able to check yourself and test that you're actually doing what you think you're doing. And that's not always the case in finance.
Right. What I think about, and one other, I think, idea that stemmed from reading the chapter on this first pillar on serving customers' interests is this notion of ethical fading. Right. I think what we hear, and you even talked about with your own students, is they fear being corrupted once they enter Wall Street. Right. That presupposes that they aren't corrupted already. Ideally, their desire to serve the interests of others could be a proxy to suggest that their desire to serve others outweighs their own self-interest or desire to serve themselves at the onset. But then somehow along the way, due to all of these different dynamics that you've described, profit pressure, right? So a whole number of things. I'm curious, what do you think are some of the safeguards that you've put in place, or that you think other leaders in finance have put in place, in year one, year two, every day in their finance career, to sort of prevent that ethical slippage, that ethical fading, to avoid that sort of slow creep of our self-interest, slowly overtaking our desire to serve the interests of our customers and of other people?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And this is an area that's massively underdeveloped in the industry. I think it's better developed in other industries, right? If you think of, for instance, in the medical profession, I think they do a better job of that. For instance, in the financial industry, frankly, the way in which we test whether we're serving our customers is basically seeing whether they stick with us or not, whether they continue generating revenues. I mean, that's the main way in which the industry operates. But I think on a day-to-day basis, particularly if you're junior, what can you do? One is first force yourself to continue creating transparency, and I think that is that is really important. This notion of transparency, because and frankly, it's easier, I think, when you're junior than when you're senior, because when you're junior, you have free rein to ask what might come across as naive questions that will force folks that are above you to answer questions about, how are you serving the customer's interest, or what are we doing here exactly, and why are we charging these fees, and are the customers aware of these fees, and all the kind of questions that become harder and harder to, I think, ask if you're a third year, if you're an associate, a VP, or even an MD. So asking pesky questions and creating transparency is a very significant tool. There's another tool that I think is very useful, which is to write things down. And as a junior person, it's perhaps a little bit harder to say, I'm going to write things down and then share them with the group. But if you have any level of seniority, you could simply create these certain processes internally where you say, well, let's write down how are we serving the customer's interests here? Are there any trade-offs for the customer? Like what are the, if the customer went through all this data and went through this action step by step and had full transparency, which is often not the case, right? But if they had full transparency, what might they say? What might they think is to their benefit, and what might they question? If you actually go through a systematic process where, and you don't want to create too much bureaucracy, of course, so you don't want to be in a situation where you get yourself to do 10 of these every day, but every so often to write things down, I think, forces you to be honest. And so I think this, it can migrate towards the concept of checklist. And I haven't seen it in the industry, but that's a concept that I think would be interesting to explore. This is one that they've introduced in the medical field to tremendous success. And so, I think that's one we should explore.
Thanks. I love the entire list. You share a couple of thoughts that come to mind for me as well in that, or what reminds me of during my time at SoFi, when I was on the leadership team launching SoFi Money, their retail banking product, right? Their debit card, their ability to accept savings, deposits, preparing for their now bank charter they filed. One thing, Anthony Noto, our CEO, right, who had a long tenured career at Goldman Sachs, at the NFL, at Twitter, Anthony Noto would actually bring up customer stories. He would actually share customer testimonials. Joanne Bradford, who was our chief marketing officer at the time, she would regularly share at every marketing team weekly meeting. They would share a testimonial from an actual member. And it sort of takes what can feel very abstract. You're looking at spreadsheets, you're looking at numbers, and suddenly it takes what is very abstract and it makes it very real and tangible. And reconnecting, I think, even junior talent, senior leaders, right, with the end customer and the actual lived experience of the end customer, I found really powerful for me. It not only, I think, taps into the empathy, and I would like to think the moral regions of our minds and souls, ideally, but I think it also is highly motivating too, right? Not only, I think, keeps people on the right path, but it drives performance. I found that really, really useful.
Yeah.
What's interesting, and it sort of, I think, segues into the second pillar, right? The second pillar of creating social wealth, right? The title is Social Wealth Creation, Contributing to Society Beyond the Customer Mandate. And what's interesting, you'd even brought this up, you're ultimately measuring whether or not you're serving your clients' interests by whether or not you retain those customers, right? Is there retention, and then is there revenue growth with those customers? But those interests of those customers, while we in finance are tasked with serving their financial needs, ultimately their financial needs, their finances are just for most customers, right? Most people who aren't ultra wealthy, who aren't in the top 0.1% of society, meeting their financial needs means housing, food, water, shelter, education, right? Safety and security and healthcare for their children. It actually it's fulfilling their broader interests and really just enabling, I would argue, human flourishing, which you talk about in the book as well. And the second pillar is what you're doing actually contributing to society. I think is inherently a way that we're actually still serving customers' interests, right? While it might not be their financial interest that they're looking to you to serve now, you're still serving their broader interests. Sort of this notion of a rising tide raises all ships comes to mind, right? In a collective, interdependent society. And so I'd love to shift into the second pillar with this. Would love to hear more about your thoughts for our listeners on the line. How can finance professionals most significantly contribute to society based on your research and the framework?
Yeah. So as you said, the challenge here is there are parts of finance where you end up serving your customers well, but you do so by extracting value. And so the first step is to make sure that doesn't happen, right? Before you even go to trying to focus on creating value, you want to make sure that you're not extracting value from others. That's the first step. And there are all sorts of examples of that, but the proverbial example is the investment firm that invests in a company that pollutes, and that firm is its pollution in some ways allows it to generate higher returns than it should, because certainly in the United States, the cost of pollution is borne by society, and they're getting away with perhaps subpar machinery that is cheaper, and their returns are higher, but we pay for it. And that's a challenge, and that's something that we need to deal with as an industry. And there's been a huge move in that respect, right? So focusing on the investment world, ESG is a great example of a trend that is seeking to do that. And it's a fascinating one in my mind, right? Because here you have a trend that initially was a moral movement that eventually morphed into one that was consistent with generating higher returns, where you're both contributing to society and generating higher returns by embedding environmental, social, and governance factors in your investment process. And now, if for the sake of this example, if we were to focus on what are the areas where you can create the most social value, well, how would you approach it? I would first say you would look at the investment first in terms of its financial returns, right? Because an investment that doesn't generate attractive financial returns is just an investment that's not sustainable, unless it's funded by philanthropic sources, which more often than not is not, right? Like the bulk of the capital in the world is capital that looks for fiduciary mandate. And in this case, that means it's really critical for any investment to generate attractive returns as a kind of a litmus test. Assuming that's the case, then what are the areas where you can create most social value? Well, I would say the second one, which is also a low-hanging fruit, to some extent, is you need to invest in something that will support the real economy. right? Because so if I invest in, I don't know, I'm a venture, like at our fund, we've invested in low-cost gyms. That supports the real economy, right? You're creating jobs. There's a real product. There's a service, and there's demand for that service, and that's what allows it to do well over time. On the other hand, at the extreme, I'll also mention some things that we do that, in my mind, are not particularly helpful to society, which is, exotic options. Like you can have complicated derivatives whose sole reason to exist is to generate financial returns, but they don't have any reason to exist outside of that, because we come up with them out of our models, and then we'll go to our counterparties and say, can you create an option that will monetize if this condition is met, and then this condition is met, and then this condition is met. They often look like macro trades, and those are not really supportive of the real economy. Are they negative to the rest of the world? It's hard to say. At the margin, they probably create some risk that in aggregate, governments and central banks don't have a full grasp of. So that's probably not great. But so, to the extent that you're going to look for the investments that are most helpful to society, you're going to look for investments that support real economic activities. And then finally, and this is where I've migrated over the years, is this notion of, well, does your investment actually help improve the business, the underlying business, or perhaps the underlying asset, right? And that's where I think there are investment strategies that can be helpful. And I think of them as the activist strategies, not activist as in the traditional concept of shareholder activism, but activist in the sense that you actually engage with your investment. And in this case, it's more often than not, it's a business, and you try to improve the business. And so in that category, I would put certainly venture capital, which not only tends to or can improve the underlying business, but can be transformative for the underlying business. And so that is probably the one that generates the most consensus in terms of looking at it as a force for good in society. But I think that's true of private equity to some extent. So in the book, I go through the metrics. So there are specific metrics, both in terms of course, the financial returns, but then also around its contribution to the economy and society. And you can there is research out there that will show the impact of these strategies on employment and on productivity and on innovation. And this is an emerging area of research, but there is empirical analysis. And private equity, in theory, should clearly help. In practice, it seems like it does, but the research is not as conclusive as you might imagine. But it still points, I think, in a positive direction. And of course, in theory, it should, because private equity, you generally end up owning control of the firm. And then there are all sorts of ways in which private equity funds deploy themselves with these firms, sitting on the board, bring to bear their entire network, bring best practices in terms of KPIs and so on, and financial controls. So that's a force for good. And then finally, shareholder activism. And that's when you take significant stakes in listed companies, and then you eventually work with management to try to improve the company in one way or the other. And that's been an important part of my investment experience in recent years. I've been very involved in doing that in Japan as a friendly, constructive activist working with Japanese companies to try to help them make them more consistent with the new corporate governance code that came out in 2015.
being extra friendly, I'm sure, operating in Japan.
Yeah. It's you have to be very, very patient and long-term in your outlook there, which is great. I mean, it actually fits. It's very consistent with our approach.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate that. I remember reading this thinking, yeah, that makes complete sense. Venture capital, private equity, activist investing being three of the ways that actual investment decisions, transactions can drive outsized social impact and societal wealth, as you call it. One other point that you brought up in this chapter that I really appreciated in this pillar was sort of the first litmus test you brought up is this actually promoting real economy activities that are truly sustainable? And the second question, and I've heard this actually from Richard Davis, someone you write about in the book, and another one of our advisors said in a different way, but you said, would you sell this product to your children?
Yeah.
If, of course, your children were in the same socioeconomic circumstances as your customers, right? I remember I heard the story about Richard Davis famously. He would have these quarterly business reviews with all the business line heads. And one day as they all came in, he sort of surprised them with this question and said, I want you all to tell me right now, are there any products in this business line that you would not enthusiastically sell to your mother-in-law?
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that example.
And if there are, we should discontinue these products.
Right.
Essentially. And I'm, of course, reducing the story and paraphrasing, and it's word of mouth. So I'm sure if Richard Davis hears this and is listening, he'd say, no, that's not how it happened, Ross. And Ross, don't tell that story. But I appreciate this. Like, would you give this product to someone you care about? And one question, as I was reading the chapter that stood out to me, maybe a third consideration that someone can ask is, is this actual transaction, is this particular business that your capital is supporting, is that meaningfully improving the quality of life of its customers, right? And this is, again, what you talked about a bit. Is this a tobacco company that's just creating cancer and addiction, right? Or is this a health food business? And this is, of course, particularly salient for venture capital, for private equity, even for activist investors who can help large businesses shift their product lines and really shift their focus. Right, you've seen a lot of large retailers, Clorox, move into naturals as an example, like with Burt's Bees and other brands. So, is this business that you're supporting, you're injecting capital into or optimizing, is the growth of this business or industry actually beneficial for customers? And that, I think, brings financial professionals into a realm of a much higher standard of knowledge, of understanding of human condition, of psychology, of health, and sort of all the factors that contribute to individual and collective flourishing. And it's one that I'm really excited to dig into in the years ahead.
Yeah. And I would say it's a very important one. I think it totally fits into that notion of social wealth creation. It can be a challenging one. And that's where, there needs to be more work done on it, because there are, for instance, all sorts of businesses that on the surface respond to a customer need, but that may not be good for the customer ultimately, right? And so there's sometimes the challenge of trying to figure out, well, is it good because they really want it and they're very excited about it, but we know it tends to maybe nurture bad habits, right? So like a good example that can be an endless source of debate is Robinhood in the financial industry. And Robinhood is this platform that allows you to essentially, so it's really targeted at retail investors, and it allows you to trade for free, right? And so on the surface, I think, and certainly the way they're positioned, the motto is democratizing finance by making it super cheap to trade. On the other hand, you could look at this and say, well, it really promotes exactly the sort of behavior that you wouldn't want your daughters, your mother-in-law, or whoever that you care about actually pursuing, right? And engaging in. You don't want to be trading all the time, because that's exactly the sort of thing that destroys value, and that brings and erodes your savings over time in a hurry. So those are challenging topics, right? Because you can see the first degree effect, the second degree effect, and the time horizon is also important.
Right. Ray Dalio would be proud if he heard this. Consider the second and third order effects of our decisions.
Right. Yeah.
And it can be infinitely complex. So I think maybe the next book can be, the list of 100 rules or criteria, so you can make it easier for us. You can give us the handbook, at least a step in that direction.
that could be the good follow-up book. Yeah.
Your third pillar, if I may shift into the third pillar of this framework, humanistic leadership, treating colleagues with dignity, empowering them, and fostering a responsible culture. You share a number of, I think, really compelling stories in the book about leaders who you think exhibited humanistic leadership. You mentioned Whitehead, right, from Goldman Sachs, a number of leaders who I think made a really significant impact at their firms. What are a couple of the kind of key highlights that you would want to bring to the attention of people listening? And what are some of the key advice that you would offer our listeners about how they can be great leaders, great teammates, and achieve some of these goals? What are the most important points?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, that's probably the simplest of all the pillars, because it's ultimately about being a good person in the workplace and being supportive of others and being collaborative and not being competitive with your colleagues. So there's something very simple and straightforward about it. And how can young leaders do that? I mean, I think there are different ways. At a simple level, you can be collaborative and be helpful to others rather than competitive. But ultimately, the goal here can be it sounds like a little vague, but the goal might be to create internal goodwill and followership, right? Because to the extent that you have people go to you as the go-to person on specific topics because they know you're going to be helpful and they know that you're not going to try to pull shenanigans and you're just going to be very straightforward with them, then it's just going to allow you to develop internal leadership. There's this concept at McKinsey, which is how much followership do you have? How many people actually go to you for advice? And that's actually incredibly valued internally, right? So I left the firm, a long time ago, but at least at that point, that was part of the review to understand whether other people naturally go to you as a mentor, as someone that, even for small questions, practical questions or bigger questions, they go to. So that I think is an important one. And it's not necessarily as easy in certain environments because there are environments that are star cultures. There are cultures that promote stars, and that means that there's an incentive for people to draw attention to themselves and compete against others, and that's what the firm is organized to do. And I recognize that can be more challenging in that environment. But ultimately, it's about carving a path that is aligned with your own values. If you're a senior person in the organization, particularly if you're the leader of the organization, the way you can create that culture is certainly by showing the way yourself, but ultimately it's about creating the incentives, right? Like ultimately, it's pay well those who support the team rather than those who call attention to themselves. Like the way you compensate people is the ultimate signal, often in finance, as to what is valued by management. And so if you very clearly show that you're compensating those who are acting virtuously in that respect, then that will lead others to try to emulate them. Other ways that you can engage in this is diversity. There are all sorts of ways to promote diversity internally. One way, what's interesting, of course, is that diversity has become an enormous priority for the industry. And, it's been a priority for some time, but certainly I think the killing of George Floyd this year and the upsurge in indignation in the country, rightfully so, I think has led the industry to think harder about diversity than it had before. And so there are all sorts of internal processes at large investment banks, for instance, and the large commercial banks and hedge funds, where they're prioritizing that now more than it did in the past. It is relatively easy, regardless of your profile internally, to get involved in these efforts.
Absolutely. And as you're well aware, diversity is something that we focus on pretty heavily at Scholars of Finance. Yeah. Gender, ethnic, cultural diversity, diversity of lived experience, cognitive diversity, right? We're very much believers in the idea that any one of us, given our life experience, our background, right, our sort of role in society and all of its contours and shapes and forms, have a different perspective on any given situation and any objective set of circumstances. All of our subjective experience is unique and different, and coming together with those variety of subjective lenses actually yields us the largest data set, right? Like the largest swath of perspective at any given point. What's interesting about the humanistic leadership pillar to me, and you say it's the simplest, right? It's the most straightforward. And I would agree. I do think that, especially when you look at how much literature there is on leadership, on how to treat others. I mean, we have religious texts dating back thousands of years telling us, to be compassionate, to be honest, all these things. A lot of what we do here at Scholars of Finance and focus on, right, is just teaching these core values that ultimately, I think, move towards pillar 3 and support pillar 3. That said, I think of all the pillars, this one, while it's the simplest, it can actually be one of the most difficult to do. Because for a variety of reasons, when you think about individuals who maybe are attracted to a star culture, right, those dimensions of their personality are neurologically wired in maybe for years or decades. Those might be central to their personality or identity. That's all, it's in our limbic system, the limbic region of our brain, not our neocortex, right? So it takes a lot of work and energy to sort of sublimate our awareness into the limbic system and rewire the limbic system itself. It takes so much energy. And so I think I've even found for myself personally, when I look at my own core values and how I define humanistic leadership, I fall so far short of being the role model I wish I were every day. If I look back over the last 5 years of my life, there's been dramatic improvement over time in sort of how consistently we can uphold these things. But I view it, the example I use often, F. Martin brought this up. F. Martin was the founder, he was a partner at Goldman Sachs, and he was the founder of their high tech group, TMT division of Goldman Sachs. Helped with the IPOs of Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, sort of a legend out here in Silicon Valley finance. He came and spoke to our students once and said, I love that you're building character now, because you need to be building it for the next 15 years. So when you actually need it, you have it, right? And sort of use this muscle model, this sports model or instrument model of, integrity, collaboration, selflessness, honesty, all these sort of virtuous behaviors that create humanistic leadership. We need to be practicing them,
yeah.
so that, 15 years from now, going back to the first pillar, when the stakes are really high, you do the right thing, not only for your customers, but when the stakes are really high and, hey, the 3 people came up with an idea together, and every part of it, and this could be a promotion, and every part of you wants to take credit for the idea, but that your 2 teammates helped, and one of them even had the initial seed of the idea, and you have the humility and integrity to say, actually, yes, I want to champion Sarah. Sarah had this idea, love it. Thank you, Sarah, for this. It can be so hard to develop.
Yeah. And, I'll mention one additional thing too. I mean, to your point, I think you're suggesting that sometimes it's hardwired, and that's hard. I mentioned sometimes the challenge is actually you're in an environment where it's not particularly valued. And in fact, there's a certain personality type that is hired and promoted, and and that makes it hard. But one way to look at this whole framework in the book is it allows you to pick your spots in the industry. So it allows you to pick where you want to be in the industry, but also within a certain corner of the industry, which firms you want to be, And that can be a way to screen for firms, right? Because if this is, if you want to follow the framework and make it easy for you to do so, it's easier to find a firm where this is valued and where they tend to recruit people that are going to show these characteristics and this profile than to go to a firm where it's actually the opposite.
Absolutely. I appreciate you raising the point. I think it's an incredibly important one that as you sort of become self-aware, right, of your leadership characteristics, of your aspirations, right, of how you can build the culture that you want to build, you actually have optionality to go and find the place that supports that. Yeah. And you'd like to think that, if there's more and more research emerging that a lot of the, these collaborative, collective, interested, focused behaviors are actually contributing to long-term value creation and competitive advantage. Ideally, firms that are creating these cultures that support these healthy behaviors actually will win out in the long term over time. I think that actually shifts pretty well, or maybe hard pivot into the fourth pillar, engaged citizenship. Right. So ideally, these firms that have these healthy cultures with humanistic leadership proliferate financial professionals with lots of resources and energy and time. And you talk about expertise, time, and wealth, contributing these to the common good. I'm curious, what do you think are some of the most practical ways that young finance professionals, even students, can do this early on in one's career?
I think there are tons of ways for them to use that. Because that's in some ways that's a great benefit of being in finance, because the skill set that you develop in finance is extremely versatile and can be used in all sorts of other parts of society, right? So you could be a first year, second year analyst in investment banking, and you will model all day long, 7 days a week. But assuming that you have time, right, to get involved in something else on the side, you could easily pick a not-for-profit, perhaps a startup not-for-profit that is exciting to you, and offer to do their accounting and their models, right? They have to set up simple models for their budget and for their projections, and so for you, often it's going to be very easy to set that up in a way that's robust and disciplined and highly structured. And so you can create systems for a tiny startup, a tiny not-for-profit, in a way that creates an enormous amount of value for that not-for-profit. So you can start doing it essentially very soon after you start investment banking. So that's certainly one example, but it's one that allows you to work across, dozens and dozens and dozens of startups in your area. So that's one. And as you become more senior, you have the ability to become more of an advisor on financial matters, because now you've gained experience, you have more insights. You can think about budgeting probably in more thoughtful ways. You can probably think about raising capital in more thoughtful ways, and then you can do and then at an even higher level, you can do what Erin Goddard did, which one of the examples in the book. This woman was 28 when I met her. That was, I think, 3 years ago. She had been an accountant at Ernst & Young in Toronto for 5 years. And she, and to Ernst & Young's credit, they have a program that allows you to take a summer off to work in a not-for-profit. And so she did that in Kigali in Rwanda. And she came back with this great insight that developing an economy like Rwanda is massively, massively impaired by the fact that there's just like an enormous dearth of accounting skills. And as a result, a lot of their companies, a lot of their not-for-profits are kind of run loosey-goosey because the numbers are not particularly believable, or they're Their finance are not run in a structured way, disciplined way, and so on. So she decided to take it upon herself to move back there. She brought with her a partner from a colleague from Ernst & Young, and they started an accounting academy there. And now that accounting academy has, their training cohorts of over 100 students. So these are folks that would have graduated from their college, and after 13 weeks of training, they're job ready. They can go into companies and be accountants. So they're not going to be CPAs, but they're going to be fully functioning accountants. And that just creates an enormous amount of value in Rwanda. Now she's expanding it outside of Rwanda. But that's an example of, you wouldn't have guessed necessarily that a finance professional with only, several years of experience could have such outsized impact simply using her skill set as a finance that she learned as a finance professional.
That's fabulous, and I found that story really inspiring hearing it. Maybe it's my own proclivity because I actually finally did it, but I love the story of like your own. The person who jumps into industry realizes that there's a bigger impact to make in a different way to pick their spot, and they just take the leap. And to some extent, I think that, a young finance professional, even a manager in a financial services firm, a portfolio manager, a senior executive, when there can be so much pressure for your career to be totalizing, right? To take up 80 hours of your week, 90 hours of your week. I hear people struggle to maintain marriages, families, friends, etc., even their own health sometimes in the industry, depending on the asset class and how young or how senior they are. I think that it can actually be a bit of a leap of faith to take on, right, some of the citizenship. You hear from young finance professionals who say, gosh, I can't do anything. I can barely sleep and breathe. And so I think it's really important actually for their own health, for their longevity, right, for them to preserve their focus on the customer mandate, on creating social wealth, on humanistic leadership, to be an engaged citizen, right? Especially in those early days when your particular role might not feel like it's fulfilling your purpose for your life, or you're making the impact you hope to make. Adam Grant, I know someone who helped with the book. A friend of yours wrote in his book Give and Take about a woman who was working in a job that was completely burning her out, and she opened up a branch of Minds Matter. It was of Minds Matter in New York, and she was working with these really gifted kids for a few hours a week. And she found that so rewarding and energizing that fueled her for the next 70 hours a week at her job, throughout the week. There's actually some emerging research that, citizenship outside of an intense, demanding job can actually fuel performance and fulfillment and energy during it. And one thing I'll note too is for scholars of finance, we've seen financial professionals from, students to first-year analysts, all the way to Richard Davis, right, on our advisory board, or Andrew Duff, former CEO, chairman of Piper Sandler, John Taft, who you write about in your book, former CEO of RBC's wealth management division, giving time, energy, resources, expertise in different ways, whether serving on a board, an associate board, being a mentor, once a month for an hour, or coming in to speak to a group of students like you have several times, right, for an hour on Zoom, advising the team, helping us get it right, or just passively donating, whether on a monthly basis or on an annual basis in a significant way. We've seen so much generosity in the industry, right? And I think fortunately it happens to be an industry that compensates well and affords people the potential to be generous. And I'm curious how you've seen sort of some of that citizenship best encouraged, right? How have you seen generosity, some of this giving back? How have you seen it be encouraged well? So, leaders listening to this discussion, what can they do to get their team, their peers, even their own managers leading up to go out and be better citizens? How can we inspire that and people around us?
Well, I think, if you're talking specifically about leaders of firms, there's a very simple way for them to promote that, is to organize yourself so that you provide a window of time during work hours where it's actually encouraged for people to take like 3 hours off and do the mentoring, right? And do the work at a not-for-profit. And if that, and that's, interesting because one, you would think, they're giving away 3 hours of work, but to your point, they probably dramatically recoup that because of the increase in productivity as people are happier in their workplace. And they, frankly, believe more in their firm and their firm's mission when that happens. And, and I remember, for instance, at McKinsey, that's what we did, where the firm actually encouraged us to do things. And so I remember when I was there, I used to teach at a public school in New York City, and I would go once a week. But the firm made it easy for me to do that because they organized it, and they would pay for the taxi to get there and to come back. And so it was understood and it was encouraged. And that makes a dramatic difference versus you trying to steal away a few hours here and there without the firm noticing because you're putting in so many hours, right? So I would say, that's a fantastic program to create more excitement amongst your junior staff.
That's great. Thanks, JC. And I actually just am taking a note to myself to actually take my staff out for a day of volunteering, which we haven't done. Building this startup nonprofit that is Scholars of Finance has definitely taken a lot of energy. So this is serving as a great reminder for me too. So thank you. You're already making an impact. We haven't even released the podcast recording yet. With that, I know we've already reached about an hour of time, and I have a few more questions I'd love to just give you as quick hits, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So you mentioned that in the book, time pressure and stress make it difficult to make ethical decisions. We talk a lot about healthy balance in Scholars of Finance. It's actually one of our 24 principles to live a healthy and balanced life, due to the belief that it actually helps you make the best decisions and do all four of these things that you unpack in your framework. Can you just share in brief how you maintain health and balance? You're busy. So how do you stay healthy? How do you combat time pressure and stress?
Yeah, I would say, there's a vast difference between what I can do now that I'm, at my age, and where I have much more control over my schedule than when I started in the industry, right? So I would say it's almost, so today, how do I maintain that balance? Well, I maintain that balance by doing things that I'm passionate about outside of my investment role, and that's largely teaching and mentoring young folks, right? And it gets to be almost 50% of what I do on a weekly basis, and it's about 50%. So it's actually a choice that I've made a number of years ago. There are big trade-offs to this because it's an unusual, atypical profile. And for all the time that I'm, spending teaching and writing, and I'm not spending, looking at investments and investing. And so there are real trade-offs to that. But at the same time, it makes me happy, right? It just makes me more productive. Now, I would say, I guess the one question that is particularly relevant probably for younger folks listening to this is, what would I do differently if I look back at myself when I started in the finance industry? There is one thing I would do differently. So this point about contributing by being involved, when I was at McKinsey, that was enormously helpful to me to be able to, once a week to go to this public school and to mentor and teach a little bit. That was incredibly helpful. The one thing that I didn't do back then, and I'm mentioning McKinsey, but obviously there are a lot of overlap with the finance industry, even though this is a management consulting firm. The one thing I didn't do that I don't know why I didn't do it, but is so important, is to engage in physical activity every single day in a way that's structured. And it sounds very pedestrian and maybe even off topic, but I'll tell you, I don't know why it took me so many years to figure that out, but 3 years ago, I read this very simple sentence. I don't know where, because I'd always run, but I ran like once or twice a week, right? And every time I ran, I felt better for the entire rest of the day. And every time I was, wow, this is so great. I can't wait to do that this weekend. And then I read somewhere, it's funny how one sentence can change your whole outlook. And this woman said, oh yeah, running, I run every day. I think of it as brushing my teeth. And I thought, of course, why wouldn't I think about it that way? And I read somewhere else that, it's 20 minutes of running is where you get to kind of cardio benefits. And so every single day I run 20 minutes. I run outside. And, this year, maybe there are like 10 days where I couldn't do it for whatever reason, but just about every single day. And I wish I had learned that when I was, in high school.
Mm-hmm.
It would have made me so much more productive. So that's my, very lowbrow pedestrian insight.
No, I appreciate you sharing. And I mean, I think it's important for people of all ages, listeners of all ages, whether they're a student, they're a first year analyst, or they're a portfolio manager, to hear that. Call it pedestrian, or I would call it just critical wisdom. I think where I've landed personally is daily exercise, like you mentioned, for endorphins, for dopamine, for serotonin, to some degree, daily meditation, right? To improve decision making, concentration, stabilize mood, 7.5 hours of sleep, 8 hours of sleep, ideally. Jeff Bezos famously was interviewed, and someone asked him, how often do you sleep each night? Like, how much do you sleep? And he sort of looks at the interviewer in a puzzled look and says, 8 hours a night. She goes, how can you sleep 8 hours a night if you're the CEO of Amazon? And he says, no, you've got it backwards. How could I be the CEO of Amazon if I don't sleep for 8 hours a night? So good sleep. And you say that to students and they laugh at you because they're all sleeping 4 hours a night. Those are a few that I would share.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is another takeaway too. And it's funny because I shared that story with my older daughter who's 8. And it's interesting because she's at the age where she is so excited about the thought of trying to stay up late at night, which for her is, 10 or 10:30. And she's already thinking of New Year's Eve where, when we allow her to stay up until midnight, and she's like super excited at that thought. And I told her, it was interesting going to college. There are no rules. As soon as you leave your household, there's no rules, right? And I got there and I realized you can stay up as late as you want. And I started meeting friends after, studying in the library at midnight, or 1 a.m. And we'd get coffee. And I thought it was so cool. And then the goal for 4 years was really to try to figure out how I can, start my classes the earliest possible and squeeze as little sleep as possible. And I realized that I was just not being productive because over the years, I realized going to bed earlier, waking up earlier makes you just more productive. And that's another hack that I wish I'd known way back.
Right. I appreciate you sharing. And I'm sure a lot of people listening right now, when we release the recording, will relate to that collegiate story of trying to squeeze as many hours of daylight or nighttime coffee in as possible. I'll try to get to a few more of these last questions I wanted to ask before we wrap up. In the book, you talk about there being core virtues that finance professionals should adhere to, saying the virtues might include honesty, integrity, prudence, loyalty, kindness, and generosity. Traits that would serve practitioners well in pursuing thoughtful careers that benefit the common good. While they may be informed by cultural differences, they apply consistently across social communities. Virtue is relevant to different types of bankers, might be no different than those relevant to a banker, a trader, et cetera. They have intrinsic benefit, not only for the professional for their capacity to lead the good life, but also for society by bolstering finance's capacity to act as a force for good. You say in particular, the bias towards temperance could help mitigate greed and other behavioral excesses that often lead finance to stray away from the common good. How do you believe aspiring leaders can cultivate those virtues? In short, like how have you tried to cultivate virtue for yourself in your life?
Right. I think, first of all, I'll say it's hard, right, to say I'm going to be prudent and loyal and kind and generous, right? I mean, you can try to be all these things, but it's hard. And so for me, what I think I would suggest, and I don't want to say what has worked for me because I don't want to be presumptuous and say I have all these virtues, but I would say for better or for worse at work, you tend to emulate people you perceive to be successful, right? And those people have outsized influence on you. So the suggestion here would be to look around and try to pick a role model or several role models, but let's say a role model who behaves in a way that is consistent with your values and the virtues that you aspire to. So temperance can be an important one, right? And then model their behavior. And ideally, go to that person and ask for advice, and little by little, try to see if they can get to mentor you. I think that's an easier path than saying, I'm going to be this, this, and that. Try to find it in others in the the context that's relevant for you, and more often than not, that's the workplace.
That's, I think, fantastic advice. As a personal believer in mentorship, I have a number of mentors. I've found that to be, I think, one of the primary ways that I've tried to grow in line with virtue in this journey that it will never end, that I'm so highly flawed in. Actually, Tony Paquette comes to mind for me. Tony Paquette was at SoFi when I was there. He's now the CFO of Point72. You've met him on our advisory board calls. I remember meeting Tony, and after seeing him in a few meetings, thinking, I want to be like him when I grow up.
Yeah, I want to be like this person. Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Clear, confident, but clearly cares about the customer, cares about this team. Culture is very important, has integrity, seems to have integrity, is very honest, very direct. And I found that very beneficial. You mentioned in the book, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say, it's still relevant at my age, right? Like at my age, I am still looking at people who are 10, 20 years older than me. And I'm drawn to these people. And I try to learn from them and emulate them. And I become kind of they become mentors. And I still meet them today. And I make it a priority to try to learn from them.
So the mentorship, it always remains valuable.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much, JC. Another question I want to ask you, in your book, you point out something interesting that Adair Turner has argued. Quote, given the evidence that inequality is an inevitable byproduct of free markets, and inequality can have a substantially negative effect on human welfare and happiness, which is not necessarily remedied by growth, there is now a greater question mark regarding the wisdom of long-term economic growth as the overarching policy goal in advanced economies. I'm curious, what are some of the ways that you have seen finance or believe finance is addressing socioeconomic inequity and inequality? Right.
I mean, I think finance has played an important role in exacerbating inequality. And so, I think you ask a good question, is that what are ways in which finance can help address that challenge? And so I think there are a few ways it can do that. Ultimately, it has to be either by serving low-income groups or investing in their communities. So you can work at a firm that predominantly serves low-income groups. That won't be your traditional investment banks. For instance, it's more likely to be community banks or perhaps small company lenders. You can invest with a focus on low-income groups, and I think that's particularly exciting because frankly, it's not an area where there's not a stampede to invest in these areas, and so you can find a lot of opportunities to invest that are not going to be very crowded. And on top of that, you can be sure that you're probably being helpful to the extent that you find investments that are sustainable and that generate attractive returns. That will most comfortably sit within impact investment world, but it doesn't have to be impact investments. I mean, we certainly, for instance, we've helped launch a low-cost gym in Toronto. But there are also, there are tons of examples of this, and certainly like Bridges is one of the preeminent impact investment funds, and I think one of their most successful investments ever was to create low-cost gyms in the UK that were in low-income communities, and so I think that those are like clear ways in which you can be helpful and address that challenge through finance.
Thanks, JC. And I just want to encourage our listeners to consider that, right? Consider maybe socioeconomic inequality as a problem they care about, but sort of what is that problem that you care about and want to solve, and how can you pick your spot, as you said, JC, in finance in such a way that you can position yourself to be solving that problem. That said, that segues into one of my last two questions. In the book, you say that, quote, your framework implies a finance professional can lead the good life by serving customers faithfully and being mindful of their responsibility and impact, the rest of the world, their stakeholders, local and extended communities, and colleagues and employees, but falls short of exhorting all finance professionals to explicitly pursue positive social impact through their professional activity in finance. At Scholars of Finance, we think that we should exhort young finance professionals to do good in their career in finance explicitly, to really take it that step further and bring this message to people to say, your career in finance, it should be to make an impact. We encourage you to. Given the opportunity to right now, to our listeners, how would you encourage finance professionals, young and old, to do so?
Yeah, and I don't think there's a difference here in approach. I think it's a question of semantics, where, of course, the goal needs to be to contribute to society. And my starting point is that finance is a force for good, and it's only to the extent that it's perverted and corrupted that it ends up not being a force for good. And the question I was addressing in that particular sense is, to what extent are you going to have a specific social goal that you're pursuing, as opposed to embedding, a general sense of contributing to society? And I'm simply contrasting that to impact investments, because impact investment is the one kind of area, certainly in the investment world, where there's actually like dual explicit goals, right? Like you're supposed to generate attractive returns, but you're also supposed to generate measurable social impact that you track, and that's part of your mandate. And so all I'm saying is that you can't automatically apply the impact investment framework to all of finance, because your technical mandate is going to be to serve your customers. Now, this being said, I think it is the case, and that's part of the framework, that you need to not only serve your customer, but do so in a way that's helpful to society. And the way you do that is to make sure you don't extract value from others, and ideally you contribute to the rest of the world. And ESG is a good example, right? Because ESG allows you to embed all these factors where you contribute to society without making an explicit goal. Their explicit mandate is still to generate attractive returns. They don't have a dual explicit mandate, all these firms that are pursuing ESG strategy, but all they're saying is that we're going to pursue these attractive financial returns while we're contributing to society and not extracting value from
it. Thank you so much for clarifying the semantics there. I'll say, to me, that's my shoulders relaxed a little hearing that after reading the book, and hearing that there really is this strong call And I hope all of our listeners and the people who ultimately read the book hear that. The book is making a strong and direct call to contribute to society through your career in finance and financial services. And I appreciate you clarifying just the contrast of impact investments in the financial activity itself. Thanks, JC. I appreciate you enlightening me. I was going to ask, last question, if you were to share one final piece of advice for our listeners who want their career in finance to contribute to the greater good that you haven't shared yet today, or that you think is the one piece of advice you hope that they hear or walk away with, what would it be?
I would say to create your own path, right? So, and the way you create your own path, and this is really the book's approach, is to find people who share your values and understand their path and try to emulate them. I think there's the underlying message of the book is that role models matter. And to the extent that you can find role models and try to follow them and emulate them, you will be able to do what you set out to do. Finance is a vast field on the whole, and it is a force for good. So it affords a lot of opportunities for young professionals to contribute to society. Just try to find your own path that is consistent with your values.
Amazing. Thanks, JC. I really appreciate it. And my sincere hope, and I'm confident that your book will help some people find their path in finance that does align with their values. I know we're coming up on time. So, JC, I want to just thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me. This was a fun conversation.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah, likewise. I think the session's been really uplifting. We're grateful for your leadership here at Scholars of Finance, helping us determine our path forward to stewarding the world's capital to serve the greater good. As an organization, me, our leadership team, all of our students across the organization, look forward to having you back soon and hopefully to having more of these conversations.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, JC. Again, appreciate your time. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Investing in Integrity by Scholars of Finance. I want to share a huge thank you to our advisors, directors, donors, team, and our members who make this all possible. If you like this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you have any feedback for us, you can send it to hello@scholarsoffinance.org or by visiting our website. Until next time, please join us on our mission to inspire character and integrity in the finance leaders of tomorrow.